me playing with the second computer. Okay, so we're transitioning into kind of the second part of the talk, which is all about starting vegetables. This is something that I just want to be totally clear up front. If you never want to start a vegetable from seed, that is totally fine. It takes a lot of work. That is I often actually buy vegetable transplants. I don't start them from seed. It's fun to do, but not everyone always has the time for this, or it's just not their favorite part of gardening. I worry sometimes that people feel like if they're not going all the way, it's not enough. No, just have fun, right? This is not supposed to be stressful. So just to kind of clear up what we're going to talk about a little bit, there's really two major types of vegetables. There's cool season and there's warm season. So cool season vegetables are the ones that grow basically fall to spring, right? And this is going to include things like most lettuces, broccoli, cabbage, onions, these sort of things. In this area, even beets to some degree and radishes are more of a cool season. And then there's warm season. These grow after frost, so our average frost is April 12th to 15th, and they grow into the fall. Corn, melon, squash, peppers, tomato, eggplant, okra, and this is what I consider kind of they're really wildly exciting vegetables for me at least. I really get a lot of pleasure out of these, and this is what we're going to be spending the rest of the talk speaking about. I'll say that a lot of what we're talking about here with starting things from seed is generalizable, right? This is not some sort of special magic information that only works for warm season vegetables. It's just a little bit easier sometimes to focus your thoughts than try to cover all things at once. So this is always the big question, right? When to plant. This is kind of the thing that gets us all hung up. And this is the major handout that you guys got. It's the Central North Carolina Planting Calendar. This is a publication from NC State. It is absolutely wonderful because it tells you both when to direct seed things and when to transplant things. And it's phenomenal because it's specifically for this area. One thing that I will say is that climate change is a doozy, right? Weather is becoming more unpredictable. It's getting harder for us to know things. And a lot of our calendars were developed before things started becoming so unpredictable. So recognize that what you see in the planting calendar represents a window, right? You'll see here for basil, right? They've got May, June, July, sow, transplant. That's a window. It's nice to be somewhere toward the beginning of it, but it doesn't mean the first day you have to go. And really pay attention to nighttime temperatures. That's what's really important for a lot of our warm season vegetables is that they're not going to get nipped by frost at all at night. They're not going to have those freezing temperatures or even, I would say, just above freezing temperatures. So pay attention to that. Yes?
S on that list was sow.
So it's seed. I think of it as sow or seed, but in the key it says seed. It's seed, transplant, bulb and crown. No, someone else already asked me that. That's the only reason I know even the order they're in. Yeah, so that's kind of nice because and that goes really to this point. That's a good transition of thinking about how do you plant a specific vegetable. Do you plant the seed directly in the ground, or is it better off planting a transplant into the ground, right? And so if you plant directly into the ground with seeds, a lot of times you'll have to go back through and thin. Actually thin your stuff. I know we all feel really brutal doing this sort of clipping technique. Don't pull them off from the roots, right? You're disturbing everyone around them by clipping them off. Everybody will be happier if you do it, except for the dead, but it's fine. And then transplants, it's a lot easier to get that spacing right. So the direct seed guys are kind of some of these, right? Carrots, beans, field peas. Most of the warm season vegetables are not direct seed, except for some of the squashes and melons. And transplant, these are going to be better, what we think of as most of the warm season vegetables. A lot of times you can kind of decide if something's going to be a direct seed or a transplant, actually to some degree based on the size of the seed, right? With, I would say, carrots being a notable exception. Carrots have tiny, tiny seeds, but most of these actually have larger seeds to, you straight up plant part of the plant into the ground, right? Whereas a lot of these have slightly smaller seeds. And of course, some can't quite decide, right? They can be grown either way. So squashes and melons, lettuces and spinaches, these are especially good in the fall. to do a transplant instead of a direct seed, because a lot of times the August temperatures are so hot that you can't quite get the good germination you want, and the plants emerge and they're like, I'm a fall crop, this is not what I meant, right? And so having the transplants that you can put in a little bit later is nice. So when you're thinking about which varieties you're going to start, this is kind of one of the big questions you come to right away, whether you're going to use open pollinated or hybrid. Open pollinated, you might also think of this as the heirloom varieties, or in some cases called the heritage varieties. But like tomatoes, right, we all think about heirlooms. The nice things about these is that, well, they often have charming stories, which I will admit I'm a total sucker for. But also you can collect seed, right? You can collect seed from that plant, and the plants you grow from that seed will basically come true to type. They will be what you expect them to be.
Question?
Yeah.
Seed life. So even these packages that we have
Yeah.
here, we're not going to use them all. You're going to talk about how...
Seed storage, yeah. Yeah, we're going to talk about that. Yes, that is something we all need to think about, is seed storage. Hybrid, and by this, for like the genetics nerds in the group, typically they mean a first generation cross, an F1. A hybrid is a recent cross between two parent varieties. They are usually more uniform, more vigorous, and they tend to have disease resistances. So a lot of times these hybrids are developed specifically to try and capture a specific disease resistance. Like, okay, I've got good flavor in this parent, I've got disease resistance in this parent, let's see if I can get those two together, right? The major downside to the hybrids is that you can't save seed, right? Just because of how first generation crosses work, the thing that you get back out is like all the flavors of the rainbow from the two parents, right? Which is like a fun experiment, but not probably what you were trying to do. A lot of times you'll hear folks talk about how heirlooms have much better flavor and hybrids are no fun. I think that some of the good hybrids grown in a good year, if you put them in a taste test up against the heirlooms, they could blow some of the heirlooms out of the water, in the same way that some of the heirlooms could blow some of the hybrids out of the water. It just depends on kind of having a good year and having a good variety that you've picked. And one of the points that was brought up in Thursday's class that was really, I think, a good thing to think about, this isn't always 100% true, but it's to think about, is that a lot of the heirlooms have been selected for really interesting colors or shapes. And I don't always feel like interesting color and interesting shape goes well with good flavor, because they've been selected for something other than flavor. In the same way that the hybrids sometimes suffer because they were selected for disease resistance instead of flavor, the heirlooms sometimes suffer because they were like selected for intrigue, I would say, instead of flavor. So just keep in mind, right? Each plant can only do so much, and if it's not putting flavor at its highest priority, it will suffer. Also, it's just fun to try things, though, so like, don't be intimidated. It'll be fine. There's always next year if you didn't like it. So how do you know that? It is actually listed right on the back of the seed packet. Unfortunately, I don't think any of you have seed packets that have a resistance. I was checking all of them. But so this is kind of hard to see, so let's take another seed packet and actually walk through really how you really read a seed packet so you can know what's on here. I am totally agnostic about which brand of seeds you should be buying. I think they're all good. I think they're all fine. I am showing this one just because I think they do a really good job labeling their information. So it's just easy for a class, right? So the first thing that you're going to want to pull up will be variety, right? And so on this one, it's actually kind of listed two ways. So Supremo is the variety, but they also tell you right here, I think I'm like holding a clicker, but I'm like, my arm's long enough. Hybrid, right? And you'll see that play out a little bit more on the seed packet. You'll figure out that it's a hybrid. Because it's a tomato, you'll actually also want to know some other things about the variety. So they also tell you that it's a determinate, and we'll talk about what that means in a minute. But multiple things about the variety are listed on this packet. Next, it'll list disease resistance. That's actually listed right here. Excellent disease resistance, including Fusarium wilt races 1 and 3, Verticillium wilt, root knot, bacterial speck, and spotted wilt. Right, so the fact that it's a hybrid, I already was kind of like, what am I getting for this being a hybrid, right? And that's what I'm getting. When we get to tomatoes, we'll talk about some of the specific resistances you might want to look for this region. Planting instructions, they list it here in kind of general terms, and then they also list it here more specifically, which I actually really like about these packets, is they will like put in all caps, recommended, right? So like if you're wavering, it's very clear actually how you're supposed to grow this thing. And I would just really follow those directions, right? Different seeds take different planting depths. Carrots want to be on top. Tomatoes want to be a little down in. You don't have to hold that all in your brain, right? Your seed packet tells you. It's fine. Just follow the instructions. And finally, packing year. And this was brought up earlier, and we'll talk about seed storage. These were packed for 2019. The reason that's important is because seed viability basically drops off, especially starting after about 2 years, and it drops at kind of a percent each year. Like it'll drop like 10 to 15% each year. And so what that means is that the percent of the seeds that will germinate will drop, and also the speed at which they will germinate will drop, right? So it's just one of those good things to be aware of. Like, we can all gamble on 6-year-old seeds. I would argue that unless it's really special, seeds aren't that expensive, and like that's not how I want to spend my time or my space, so like maybe just buy some seeds because it's fun too. But just know that like that is hard. Seeds don't last forever. Although we'll talk about some tricks for getting them to last a little bit longer. Starting vegetables. 2 major things you're going to need. You're going to need media, and you're going to need something to put your media in, right? What do I mean by media? I mean the actual potting soil you put them in, right? You can use seed starting mix, which is often wonderful, light, fluffy stuff. Like I look at seed starting mix, and I'm like, man, if I was a seed, I'd want to be in there. You know, it looks good, right? It often has really no nutrient value to it whatsoever. It is a nutrientless media, and that's because it helps with germination. It helps make sure that little baby plants aren't burned in any way. If you are a lazier, or I would argue more pragmatic person, you can start in fresh potting soil, something that's got a little tiny bit of a nutrient to it. I personally really like starting in potting soil because A, I can't be bothered to go buy seed starting mix. B, I will forget to fertilize my things, so I like having a little bit of fertilizer already in that mix. Like you'll look at a bag of potting soil, right, and it'll say like 464 on the bag of potting soil. You know there's a nutrient component to that.
If you have potting soil like left over from last year, you sealed it up pretty good, is it still going to deteriorate?
No, it'll be good. I would use that. The one thing I will caution against, sealed up, ready to go. Right? If it's still moist in that bag, use it. If it's bone dry and you're trying to rehydrate it, I personally would get rid of it because I know, and this is totally anecdotal, but I know from my own personal experience, I tried doing that a couple years ago where I was like, whatever, I'll just rehydrate it. And I did, and I started a flat of tomatoes, so it was 32 tomatoes in that rehydrated media at the same time that I started 32 tomatoes in brand new media, and the rehydrated media never really caught up to the brand new media, and they were planted at the exact same time. Across the board, the plants were smaller. Soil, after it dries, can become quite hydrophobic. It doesn't even like taking on water anymore. I also wonder if something happened with the microbial composition, where like it dried out and just got angry. But anecdotal, I would buy new soil in that situation. Gotta figure out what to put it in, right? So you want to start with fresh potting soil or seed starting soil every time. You want to start with clean containers. And by clean, I do mean like at very least get all the obvious plant matter and soil off of last year's containers, right? Best case scenario, maybe even a slight disinfectant. There are a number of different kind of nice, I would say, or fancy, however you want to call it, containers that you can go buy at big box stores or local garden centers that all work really, really well. I personally, these are flats or trays. You know, the pots go in these. I like this size. This is the kind of the industry standard size. I like it because I just personally like sticking with standards, knowing that like if I buy something in the future, it'll fit in here. These come in both holeless and ones with little slits in them. So if you know you want to put it outside and drain it later, right? This drains, this doesn't. I grow inside in my spare bedroom, so I need something that does not drain, right? In terms of pot sizes, something like this works really well for a final pot size for most vegetables. Smaller than this, you're going to have problems. Again, this is the nice thing about sticking to an industry standard, right? Like that just, it fits. If I need to water, I can basically pop one of these out and water under it. These will disconnect from each other. You'll see things in smaller sizes, kind of like in here, and like what we think of as a 4-pack or a 6-pack. I don't really think these are big enough for final plant sizes for a lot of our warm season vegetables. Like your tomatoes are going to be like feeling away in this size, but you can make a go of it. Maybe you just transplant sooner, right? Like maybe you seed a little bit later, transplant a little bit sooner, and they'll be fine. The other thing that I think can help, if you want to get really techie about it, so you could certainly jerry-rig something else up. This is a humidity dome. It fits right on top of one of these flats. I personally like this, especially for seed starting. This dome, I think, is too tall. There are domes that are only about half as high. Those work really well for seed starting in terms of keeping your humidity up, even capturing a little bit of heat from your lights. You'll be using LEDs or incandescents, so they won't, or not incandescents, fluorescents? Yeah, fluorescents. You'll be using lights that don't give off heat, so they won't capture much heat, but they'll capture a little bit. I think that's nice because, again, being someone who tends to like have the best of intentions and then wander away and come back 3 days later and be like, I was supposed to be checking on you every day. I like having this sort of stopgap, right? I wouldn't buy something tall like this. This is really more for grafting or for kind of other purposes because you want to keep your lights really low, and we'll talk about that in a minute.
What about saran wrap?
Totally would work. Yeah, just don't fill too tall with soil, and then just saran wrap over it. And once you start seeing them come up, just do it. You know, I will admit that I've like, having worked in greenhouses in the past, I have a tendency to be like, industry standards, you know, everything will work. I mean, that's something I even really like about this picture here is that this one here on the lower left, right, that's a sandwich box. Sure, right? The clamshell that your lettuce comes in, put some holes in the bottom of that thing, call it a day, right? Like, I grew up, my dad grew in styrofoam cups. It's fine, right? Like, put some holes in it, call it a day, right? You don't need to do this route.
If you put the holes in the bottom of that container and you would use a regular tray like you just showed us, right?
Yeah, exactly. You put holes in the bottom, you put it in a regular tray, you put it in a pie tin, you put it in
whatever. Just to hold the water.
Yeah, totally. In terms of light and water, grow lights really are ideal, right? Grow lights work really well. They don't have to be super expensive. Baby plants kind of don't know what's going on, right? You can use shop lights. People have good luck with that, right? You can get a grow light on Amazon for not that much money, or you can buy shop lights. You can buy whatever you want. The real trick here is to just keep it tight to the plant, right? So if I was starting in something like this, I would start with my grow lights here, right? And as the plants started germinating, I would move them up. But I'm always keeping them 2 to 3 inches above. And so you can do that either by, you know, maybe your light is at a fixed height and you raise this up and down like a stack of books, or maybe the lights get raised up and down with 2 stacks of books, right? Like you can jerry-rig this, like you can figure out how to make that work. But the real benefit to keeping your lights tight is that it prevents that sort of really extreme legginess or kind of tallness that you see, and it just kind of keeps everything a little bit more going at the same rate. You certainly can do it in the window. You can, right? You just need to keep an eye on it. South-facing window is really good because it's got kind of continuous light throughout the day. South, I would say, is best. North, I would say, is worst. East and west, just keep an eye on it, right? And just be rotating your little tray. Because the real thing is like your plants are getting all their light from one direction, right? The direction of the window. So everybody's just going to be kind of like, ah, right? And so you kind of have to keep rotating them. Otherwise, you'll come back, right? And everybody is profoundly that way, and it's hard to fix. For water regularly. Water the roots, not the leaves, and keep evenly moist but not soggy. So another thing, so the real reason to not keep things soggy is actually because a lot of diseases that can take down very young seedlings really like those wet conditions. So you were starting with clean containers and sterile media, right? Because that's what your potting soil is. You should be fine, but like, we've all got grubby hands. We were all just out playing in the garden and then we touched our stuff, right? Like who knows what you've reintroduced? And so it's just better to not have too much moisture because that's really where a lot of those diseases can kind of take hold. And what I would say is that the one compromise you can kind of do is I was growing tomatoes for some of the master gardeners, and they found out my dirty secret of how I grow tomatoes, and they were all horrified. Bev's laughing in the back because she was like, oh my god. But I've never had trouble with it. I would take this tray, and I would have it full to about right there with water. Just a little baby amount of water sitting in the bottom of the tray almost all the time. Because again, forgetful, have other things to do, right? It's easier for me to double check that there's a baby amount of water on the tray than to like be playing that game constantly of like, they are evenly moist, but there is no extra water. The one thing that'll happen is the roots will start growing at the bottom of the flats pretty dramatically. You'll get these long, white, stringy roots. You just break them off. It's fine. Nobody cares. Any more than that, though, and it can wick up the soil, right? And it'll keep the soil evenly moist. Or if I were growing in very low pots, I wouldn't do that. Because again, like it'll wick up the soil. So, seeding and transplanting techniques. Direct seed plants, you don't need to transplant. That's pretty straightforward. Definitional. Many transplanted vegetables can actually be transplanted twice. And so this is, again, I would consider like a little bit of like a next level way to do this, but it's something to consider if maybe you've done this a couple times and you're feeling comfortable. It really helps save space. So what you would do is you would get something like that lettuce container or that sandwich box or some sort of, right, pot like this that was a little bit bigger, and you would kind of spread your seed out across that a little bit uniformly, and what you'll get coming up is right, a lot of plants. And then once they've reached a small height, like a little baby height, right, they've got their seed leaves out, but they don't have their true leaves out. Don't worry, we'll talk about that in a minute. You actually pop it out, and with a pair of tweezers, you gently tweeze them from the base, and you basically sink those leaves down to the soil level in a new pot. The reason that's to do this is because with tomatoes especially, I like to sink plants like that because you know tomatoes get spindly, they get leggy. I like to fight it. Tomatoes will put everything out. They'll put roots out from that whole stem anyway. It's a good way to conserve space, right? So when I'm starting, if I'm starting a bunch of varieties, but like half the seed packs are old and like I'm not really sure how it's gonna go, right? I might only have 6 pots, one with each variety, and then whatever was most successful. The best looking plants are the ones that get transplanted, right? I don't have to transplant all the weird sickly ones and then take care of them in their pots because they're next to like their brothers and sisters. I just get rid of them at that point. I personally really like doing this. Certainly don't have to do it. If you're not gonna do that, I would recommend putting like 2 to 3 seeds per hole and clipping the weakest ones to leave a strong one, right? When they're at kind of this stage. You'll see, like, some will come up funny, or they'll come up weird, or they'll come up, like, not coming out of their seed case, right? The major caveat to this, know yourself. Many of us will not clip the weak ones. We will not abandon the ones that need help, right? We will just be left with a bunch of seeds in a pot, or a bunch of pots of really spindly plants. If you don't think that you can do this and be brutal, 1 seed per pot. Don't do the seed thing, okay? Like, you just need to know that about yourself, okay? I can see some of you guys like starting to blanch, like, my babies!
Related question.
Yeah.
I was taught that for tomato plants, for exactly the reason that you mentioned, that you can plant tomato plants outside before when it's still frosting. If you dig a deep hole and you plant it at the bottom, and then you fill in the hole as it goes out. Because I did find that they didn't fall over because they were like anchored.
It's always good practice to plant them deep, and we'll talk about that for a minute. Our frost is coming. Our last frost is coming earlier and earlier, right? Our frosts are stopping earlier and earlier. So I see no reason to try and fight the frost date here, just because here our last frost used to be April 12th, if memory serves, and I find that most of the time by April 1st, I can look at the 2-week forecast and I'm like, we're not getting a frost. So, but it's always good to plant tomatoes deep. Okay, got your little seedlings, got your little babies, you're excited. It's time to move them outside, right? Like that transplant day is on your calendar. Your little indoor seedlings are too delicate to go directly outside, right? Many of them have never experienced wind before, right? Like there are like normal, everyday world occurrences that they have no idea about. They're not ready for that. So the first thing you do is you move them from shade to full sun very slowly over about the course of a week. This is a process you might hear called hardening off, right? So the first day, you go and put them out in shade for like 2 hours, and then you bring them inside during the warm part of the day, right? And then the next day, a little bit less shade, a little bit longer, right? Bring them inside. And you kind of do this until you've worked them to that full sun condition over the course of a week. What I personally do, and this is also very reasonable, is like I put them at the edge of the covered porch the first day. Probably forget about them overnight. Move them out a little bit off the covered porch the next day. Probably forget about them. And I just am kind of marching them out to my raised beds that are in my front yard, right? This will work well. This is more likely to work downtown in this area. We are actually a fair bit warmer than the rural parts of the county. If you live in the northern part of the county, if you live in Rougemont or Bahama, do the proper hardening off technique. If you live in the city center, you can get away with a little bit more laziness because we just have naturally warmer conditions. Even then, I would still keep an eye on everything, right? And I'm not saying you don't need to harden them off. I'm just saying, like, I work all day. I don't have time for, like, 2 hours outside in the middle of the day, right?
I have a question about the grow light.
Yeah.
When should it be on 24 hours?
Oh, sorry, yeah. 16 hours is a good rule of thumb. Most veggies really like that. 16 hours on, 8 hours off. Just set it on timer. My house this time of year looks like I'm growing some sort of like, I have like a grow operation in my front room, right? But that's a good amount of time. If you see wilting or what I consider burning, move them back into the shade and give them a little bit of water, right? And so burning is pretty distinctive, right? Like this is a tomato that's had burn during hardening off. It's gone completely white in that area. Wilting, I think, is a little bit more normal that I see sometimes, like using my method. Like I just come out and everyone's like, oh my God. You know, and I just hit them with some water and I move them back a day, basically. If you buy transplants, it's always worth asking if they've been hardened off, like you're at the farmer's market or something, but like they've been hardened off, is what I would say, right? There is no value in someone at the farmer's market selling you a tomato plant that hasn't been hardened off and you go home and it just dies, right? Like that doesn't do that many service. Typically things have been hardened off, unless there's a good reason. Everyone's burning questions, seed storage. Okay, so you've bought all these fancy varieties, you're feeling real good about yourself. How do you actually take care of them so that they last a little bit longer than 2 years? Really, it's actually very easy. You put them in your crisper drawer in your fridge. Like, the crisper drawer in your fridge is just the right conditions for seed storage, actually, and you can improve your germination, like the length of your germination window, just by keeping your seeds there. And so, like, if you're a real gardener, if I come to your house, your crisper drawer should have, not have vegetables, it should have, like, future vegetables, right? And if you're ever in doubt, a germination test is really easy. And so what this is just you take 5 to 10 seeds from the pack, depending on how many you have and how many you can spare, right? Take a paper towel, get it wet, wring it out so it's just kind of like damp, not sopping. You'd have your paper towel, put your seeds down, sandwich your paper towel, put it in a plastic bag in just like a warm spot in your house, and then come back and check in 5 days, in 10 days, in 15 days, and see if you can see little tiny leaves and little tiny roots emerging, right? And then if you could say, okay, 4 of 5 had little tiny leaves emerge. My germination rate's around 80%, right? 0 of 5 had little tiny leaves emerging. 2 weeks later, I'd be like, time to go seed shopping. This is something you just found out. Also, that's one benefit to using the seed bed technique to starting your seeds, right? I don't do a germination test, I just throw it on soil and see what happens, right? Inevitably, you will need this. Troubleshooting. So, poor germination, right? Check the ambient temperature. For the most part, our houses are the right temperature for germination, somewhere in that like 65 to 75 window, but like just, if you had them out in the garage, might have been a little cold, right? Seed age, planting depth, right? Did you actually read the seed packet or did you just like put that thing down in their whole hog, right? The way that mulch works is by putting too much matter on top of the little baby seed so that the seed can't get through. Putting that seed way too deep will do the same thing. Finally, making sure that there was water and not too much water. Especially if you see seedlings emerge and then you see them immediately collapse, that was probably too much water. That was one of the kind of many root diseases that can take seedlings down. Tall, leggy seedlings, check light and crowding. And so this was kind of an interesting conversation we had in Thursday's class where if you're getting legginess early, right after germination, that's when your plants are really kind of getting leggy and having a hard time. That's often a light issue, right? They didn't have their light close enough to them and they're really going for it. If you're getting legginess much later and you had good lights, right? Oftentimes it's actually a crowding issue, or at least it can be. And the reason for that is that plants are actually very, very smart and they can actually sense the other little plants around them if they're too close, right? And so they'll be picking up on all these cues from the little plants around them and they're like, oh my God, everybody's getting big. I need sunlight. I'm going up, right? And they all like decide at the same moment. They're like, I'm going up, right? And it means everybody gets leggy at kind of around the same time. So, and then yellow or discolored leaves. This is often a nutrient deficiency, except for if it's on the very first little cotyledon and seed leaves, which we'll talk about. Those always drop off. Something like this, though, on tomatoes, that's a nutrient deficiency. You can hit them with just a little bit of that liquid fertilizer, right? That sort of rapid boost fertilizer. Just follow the label on the fertilizer bottle. It will tell you the right rate for seedlings. Oftentimes on tomatoes, you get this sort of purpling on the undersides of leaves. That actually is sometimes a nutrient thing, sometimes it's a temperature thing. If you feel like the room is a little bit cool, it's likely a temperature thing, because that's actually something interesting where it's a phosphorus deficiency, but it's actually because they can't uptake phosphorus properly at low temperatures. So you could keep adding phosphorus forever, but if it stays very cool, right, they can't uptake it. Okay. All right, now, greatest hits. Okay. So, again, we're going to talk a little bit about this direct seed versus transplant distinction. And I just pulled these little logos and they're going to be in the upper right-hand side corner of the slides so that you know which one it is, but also know that you could always pull that information from your planting calendar, kind of what's recommended. All right, so sweet corn needs a lot of space, right? It needs a lot of space for itself. It also gets very tall and will shade the things around it. You often need multiple varieties because of the way they cross-pollinate. It needs a lot of nitrogen, and you're going to want to stagger plantings every 2 weeks. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm from the Midwest. I'm actually from Indiana. So anytime someone's like, I'm going to plant corn in less than hundreds of acres, I'm like, why? Sure, I mean, one could. I personally would say, like, this is fun, but it does take space. Make sure you think about how you're planting other things because it gets so tall it shades other things. But it is fun. Legumes, these are always great because they do help your soil if you leave those roots in. So beans, lima, butter, and green, the greatest hits of beans. They often don't produce in hot weather for the butter and the lima beans. And then beans also, green beans come in bush and pole varieties. So bush, as you might imagine, it's kind of bushy. It's low, right? Pole does require some sort of trellising or something else for your beans to grow up. And just be mindful when you're making your trellises that you don't make them taller than your arm, right? Every year I do this. Southern peas, we have field peas, black-eyed peas, and these need really warm soils to kind of get going. And then finally we have peanuts. These are kind of a fun plant, and I think they're interesting. I think there are easier ways to get peanuts, right? Like, there are easier ways to get all these vegetables, but peanuts especially. Like, they're easier. The one thing I really just, like, want to talk about with peanuts, because I think it's so cool, is that, like, it has to send something out from the top of the plant underground to grow the peanut. What else grows like that, right? That's just fun. So, you know, you could try it. It's kind of a cool idea. The early cucurbits. So this is going to be cucumber, summer squash, and zucchini. I kind of think of these all collectively as like the summer squashes. They are very productive. 1 to 2 plants is enough. They are also very large. So 1 to 2 plants is enough, right? Like they take up space. They're kind of thugs in terms of how much they ramble. And you want to plant up to the cotyledons or so direct. And so I'll talk about that in a minute, but I just wanted to point this out for folks trying this for the first time. Squashes produce male and female flowers. The male flowers start blooming first. And so like you'll go to the farmer's market and you'll see squash blossoms for sale. You can fry them up, they're delicious. It's because they were the male flowers. And so if you plant squash, don't freak out when your first couple blossoms do not produce squash. The way you can tell the difference between the two, if you see this one back here, it's got a really thin stem, that's a male, right? If you see this one here, it hasn't even opened yet, but you can tell it's kind of thick at the base, that's a female, right? This is the portion that will become the squash. So just like, if you're freaking out because you got blossoms but you don't have squash, just go and check the stems, right? And see if they were ever even going to produce squash. So the cotyledon, and we kind of talked around this a little bit, these are the seed leaves. They always look different on plants than the true leaves do. So, right, so on this guy, they're kind of fat. On beans especially, they're very fat. They're very meaty. On tomatoes, they are often kind of thin. They don't have the normal tomato shape to them. These are the first the first little leaves that were in the seed. It's kind of like just the power until the things start going, right? And so for on many plants, you'll plant up to the seed leaves, the summer squash especially. Also, your seed leaves will always kind of yellow or brown and drop off. That's not you. That's what they're programmed to do. Yeah?
What do you mean plant up to, like, are you supposed to continue planting nearby until they reach this point?
No, yeah, sorry, that's really confusing. So like this plant, if I had had this as a transplant, I would have dropped up to here in the soil.
So you
Plant
would
up
cover.
to, like, right, if these were my seed leaves, this would be soil.
Oh, and you put the rest of it under?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you don't plant the leaves into the soil, but just up to it.
I would probably pull them off and just drop it, but yeah. Yeah. So it's especially because it's like if the plant kind of gets wiggly and starts doing its own thing, you can drop that up to the seed leaves into the soil. It's always interesting to like hear something when you're like, oh, I never would have thought of that phrase working that way. Cool. Okay. Some real talk about the summer squashes, the cucurbits. Downy mildew is a very serious problem. You will probably get it. There's not an easy way for homeowners to treat it. It will often wipe out your late crops, right? Downy mildew, I will say, it's not powdery mildew, which you've probably heard of. Downy mildew is actually quite interesting, and I think quite pretty, because it grows very geometrically. It grows in the interveinal spaces, so like you can see it's got like sharp lines on these spots, right? Like these are not circles. Every year for commercial growers, there's like a downy mildew watch, and we all have to report when we've seen downy mildew, right? Like this will come for your plants. Once you start seeing this problem, I would just take out the plant and plant something else there. Don't put it in your compost. I would actually dispose of this plant. This is the real one. This is why I don't grow squash anymore. Squash vine borer, it's this little moth. What it really loves to do is it flies around until it can find, especially the summer squashes, so the zucchinis, cucumbers, any of these soft stem squashes, lays an egg right in the base, right near the soil, and that egg grows into this fat little caterpillar, and it just eats the entire center of the stem, right? And so what will happen is you'll come out and your squash was totally happy, like just moving right along, and it's wilted. And you'll water it. And you'll come back the next day and it like looks worse. Look around the base. There's probably little dark stuff, frass, that's insect poop. You might even be able to see the base starting to split because the caterpillar got so fat. There's no saving it at that point, because the caterpillar is just basically eaten out all the vascular tissue that the plant needed to support itself. Again, that's a total like dispose of the plant problem. Don't put it in your compost. Don't ignore it either, because after this guy is done being like the happy little caterpillar, he'll drop into the soil and actually overwinter right there by that plant. So then he's like ready to go next year, right? Exactly on your squash spot. And so these are very hard to prevent too. You'll kind of hear methods for preventing them, things like wrapping in tinfoil, applying insecticides, like different things like that. I've wrapped things in tinfoil, never had good luck. Yeah.
I tried to battle it for years, and once it's in your garden bed, you can't even rotate your crops around to
Right.
avoid it.
Because they fly.
So a master gardener taught me that this was in Maryland on Father's Day.
Yeah.
If you put some insecticide, because I'm an organic gardener.
Like BT.
Or 7.
Yeah.
I hate to say that out loud, but if you just do it, just a squirt at the base of where your stem hits the soil. I just did it once, Father's Day, and I overcame it.
Really? Yeah, and so one thing that people do recommend is BT. It's an organic insecticide. It's actually a soil bacteria, Bacillus thuringiensis, that farmers have been using since the 30s. Applying that kind of liberally around the base. The hard thing in this area for this guy is that these actually have a double life cycle in the south because it's warmer and wetter, so they fly twice. And so they can be hard to capture, and you do have to capture that caterpillar egg basically on the way in, right? Because once it's in that stem, it's really protected. So if you catch it early enough, you can very delicately slice open the stem, carve out the caterpillar, and rebind the stem. Again, oh man, summer squash comes ready at the same time every year, and everyone's summer squash comes ready at the same time, right? Like, it's like 60 cents a pound. This is a lot for that, especially because these plants take up a lot of space. If you have a limited amount of space, they're pretty. I mean, they got that going for them. Their diseases are pretty. Yeah. So ultimately, this is, rotation will only get you so far, right? They fly. But sanitation. If you see this happening, pull the plant out. Don't put it in the compost. Get rid of it.
And if you can cover the plants if you know that there are these.
Yeah, so you could put row cover down, and that would totally work. You need to know your fly windows, though. And that will be, right when those adult moths are emerging and when they're flying, and that will be somewhat dependent on each year's temperatures. Which to me sounds like a lot to keep track of. But you can. Yeah, make sure you remove those row covers, though, because you are going to need those pollinators later. Okay, winter squash, pumpkins, and gourds. These are nice because they actually don't tend to have the same amount of problem with the squash borer because they have a somewhat different internal stem structure that's a little bit harder. They're harder stemmed. Still start early to avoid the vine borer. That's basically to give that stem time to build itself up. Soil does need to be warm for them to get going, though. Ornamental gourds are often the easiest. And pumpkins and winter squash often require fungicide sprays to control foliar diseases, so diseases on the leaves. A lot of these, too, they get to a size where you want to rotate them regularly, like the fruits themselves, because otherwise they get, like, bed sores, basically, you know. Obviously, fertilizer is important, right? That's a lot for a plant to produce. Cantaloupe prefer drier conditions, while watermelons actually like consistent moisture. The seedless varieties are more finicky, but there are some good ones that are reliable. So this is kind of a fun thing to do. I personally, if I was going to grow any sort of gourd, I think some of the ornamental gourds are actually really kind of fun and interesting. Things like birdhouse gourds, loofah gourds, that kind of stuff. It's like interesting and fun, and if it doesn't work out, I don't feel like I've really lost something. I just like have less loofahs, which is like, it's fine. Star of the show. Okay. So tomatoes. These are really the most popular thing for home gardeners. Most people come in and they either want to figure out what's going on with their lawn or talk about tomatoes, right? Unfortunately, they can be very disease prone. I actually think that these are a somewhat more complicated thing to grow. Not to say you shouldn't try, but you are not alone when it starts looking real hairy come late July. Okay, we all are going through that. So if you're gonna look for resistance in your seed packets, verticillium and bacterial wilt are highly recommended. For a project that the Master Gardeners are working on, we reached out to Dr. Chris Gunter at NC State, who's the tomato specialist, and said, what are the resistances you would really be looking for in tomatoes for this area? And he said, verticillium and bacterial wilt are good ones to start with, and those are soil-borne diseases. There's many ways to classify tomatoes. This can almost become a little bit mind-numbing, right? So there's kind of the way we think about tomatoes, right? Things like a slicer, paste, grape, cherry, dwarf, right? Oxheart, which are kind of these fun, weird-shaped tomatoes. The paste tomatoes, right, are the ones that are really good for canning. And they tend to be determinate, so they all come out at the same time, which is good for canning, right? There's determinate versus indeterminate. We'll talk about that in a minute. And also heirloom versus hybrid, which we've talked about earlier. So this is kind of one of your major questions when you're growing tomatoes. Do you want determinate or do you want indeterminate? So the determinate types are smaller overall size to the plant. They set fruit over a short period. They will continue setting fruit after that, but they really kind of like to set all their fruit more or less at once. And they're often better suited for container gardening because of that, right? They have a small shape. There's some really excellent dwarf varieties that are being developed that they tend to be determinate, but there are some indeterminates in there. But in general, unless you're looking for like a specialty dwarf variety, determinates are going to be a little bit easier in containers. One thing I would say to think about with that is that on tomato seed packets, you'll often see time to maturity, right? It'll be like 55 days, 75 days, 85 days. If I had 3 containers and I wanted to plant determinate tomatoes because they're containers, I might pick a 55, a 75, and an 80, right? Something like this to spread my timing out. I probably wouldn't plant 3 of the exact same thing unless I was canning, right? Because you're going to have a lot of tomatoes all at once. Indeterminate. These can grow very tall. I have heard tomatoes referred to as vines, and I didn't really understand what people meant until I saw, like, there are commercial production systems, right, where the tomatoes get suspended at the top, and then the pot just gets scooted down, right? So you'll walk in and you'll see a tomato 20 feet, and they just keep scooting that pot down in the hothouse, right? These can get very tall. So all tomatoes need some amount of support. Your indeterminates need support, right? Like they're going to need something to them. And they produce their fruit throughout the season. After they start, they're going to keep going. Most of our tomatoes do kind of have a really hard time and struggle through August because of very high temperatures. The temperatures are actually so high that they can't set fruit properly. But if you can baby them through that, oftentimes you'll get more fruit afterwards. I would say it's also a time to think about tearing out your garden and getting ready for a fall planting of something else. But I can be ruthless with seedlings. With mature tomato plants, I like baby everybody through. Like we're gonna make it to this fall, so just know.
What about pruning?
Yeah, so pruning tomatoes is kind of a thing unto itself. So I'm not going to go too much in detail, but the things I'll say with tomatoes is kind of the most important thing about pruning your tomatoes, I would really say, is getting the leaves up, right? So you plant the plant and it might only be this tall, but I would take off as many of the lower leaves as I felt comfortable. And I'll show that in a slide. As my plant gets this tall, I would take off more lower leaves. I'm looking for about 12 inches of space between the lower leaves and the ground. And that's because many of the things that impact tomatoes are soil-borne and they're splashing up. So even though I mulch, I want that space, right? That's kind of the major aspect of pruning, I would say. With tomatoes, you know, some people remove suckers, which are little, here's the main stem, here's the side stem, little thing comes out here. I remove suckers, a lot of people don't. I think that that's, for a home gardener, a matter of preference. It's those leaves, though, I would get up.
What about topping?
Yeah.
It's hard in my heart to top anything, just because I don't like it.
What's topping?
You take off that, so like every plant, not every plant, a lot of plants have like a central top, right, like a tree, right? There's that thing at the very top, and if you just, everything on the sides grows out and bushes out. So the reason I personally wouldn't do it is because oftentimes a plant can produce so much fruit mass. And you can either get that in a smaller number of bigger fruits, or you can get that in more smaller fruits, right? Topping encourages bushiness, and so then you would get more smaller fruits from all those side branches. I just like big fruit. Like, I don't know, I would rather have bigger fruits, and so I would let it grow up, but.
Well, what do you do? I mean, I guess one of the questions that could go with that is, if it's going to go up 20 feet, you can't get
It's
out.
not going to in a home.
Okay.
Yeah, it's going to go up like 8-ish. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So this is kind of what we talked about earlier, that it's really nice to plant tomatoes deep, right? You remove all these leaves. You don't want any leaves underground. because that's a good place for disease to take hold. Ignore these pots. I don't know why they left these pots on in this illustration. I think that's terrible. Some people do it in a trench method. I often am I just dig straight down. I dig 8 inches, 8 to 12 inches down and drop the plant as far as I can. Just because you'll get roots all along in here. And this is that same idea of removing diseased and damaged leaves, but just the lower leaves when you plant, because you're just trying to get those leaves off the soil. Peppers are very easy once they are started, but they can be a little bit finicky. I personally find that peppers tend to get a little bit finickier the hotter they get. I think partially that's also probably because some of those hot pepper seeds are a little bit more specialty, and I'm not sure people are growing them quite as much. And they're very productive when they're fertilized. So if you're having trouble getting your pepper seeds started, something that can really help is a heat mat under your under your seeds when they're first starting. Take the heat off once the germination has happened, but just that little bit of heat can help. If you're really having trouble, something like a germination test, right? So where I do it in a bowl, like a shallow bowl of water, but you could do it certainly on a paper towel, where basically you put 10 seeds in that water or on that paper towel, you watch it, and as you see the germination happen, you plant that plant, right? Because then I just know what's gone into the pot, as opposed to I don't know, maybe, fingers crossed. I think we all know this is kind of the major way you're going to see peppers classified, by the Scoville heat index. I think most people are going to be happy sticking somewhere around here. This is fun though, and some of these peppers start looking really weird. And we recently bought something for the Master Gardener plant sale that I think is off this. It's hotter. There are new varieties that are coming out hotter than ghost peppers, and there were 2 of them. One was called Carolina Reaper, but we saw one was like Death Spiral, and one was Apocalypse Scorpion, and it was extremely hard for me to decide between the 2 because I was like, that is awesome. I think we did Death Spiral.
We did.
Yeah. 12 million. 2 million. Yeah. So anyway. And we've got a couple more to get through, don't worry. So eggplant's really not hard to grow. It's actually quite easy to grow, and I think one of the nice things about eggplant especially is that there's so many different varieties based on cuisines, right? There's Italian eggplant, there's Thai eggplant. Thai eggplant especially, you start getting into all these really strange things, to me at least, that don't even look like eggplants. That's why I mean they're strange. It's I would not have thought that was an eggplant, right? There's some really cool stuff, but even then, a Black Beauty eggplant is a classic, and it's delicious, and it does a good job, right? There's Japanese eggplant. This is just something that I don't think of as being a particularly interesting vegetable, but actually really is. And I would just say wait to plant them when they're warm. Okra I really like because I consider it half edible, half ornamental. So okra is very, very closely related to hibiscus actually, and some other plants like that. And so it's got these really beautiful flowers that are going to open out and be big. And so okra, when you have the time and patience for it, rewards you with 2 to 3 inch long pods that you have to harvest every day, right? Every 2 days, right? It's so productive and they grow so quickly that it's awesome if you're into okra and you have some time. If you're into okra and you have some time for a while and then you get distracted, you get really pretty flowers, right? And then the pods get too long and you go out every once in a while and you whack them all off and you throw them in the compost and then it starts flowering again. And it's kind of a big plant with some presence. And so I kind of think either way it's a win, right? I either remember to harvest the okra or I don't. I don't think of us as having too many nematode problems in this area, but just do rotation on this one just to prevent any problems. Sweet potatoes, I feel like we're in North Carolina. I have to talk about sweet potatoes. They need a lot of space. You want to buy certified cuttings, and deer do love sweet potato vines. So that's kind of a catch-22, right? You need a lot of space, but deer love them. That's hard. Cure to increase the sugar content. And so this is just a way of basically harvesting them and letting them sit for a period to get that sugar content up and to get them where they need to be from what we think of as a commercial sweet potato. And now I'm just going to do a really, really quick thing on herbs. My nerd brain was herbs are not vegetables. They do not count. I was everybody just wants to talk about basil. It's fine. So herbs kind of span the spectrum from annual to perennial, right? And so when you think about some of the summer herbs, things like basil truly is an annual, right? Dill is an annual. Parsley should be treated like an annual for the most part, right? Sage will die after a while, right? Down through to something like rosemary, which like if that thing is sited properly, like it's gonna go on forever. It's gonna get bigger, it's gonna like threaten your house.
The plant shades the rest of my garden
Yeah.
for a year.
Yeah, they're so happy, they're so good, right? And so the one thing I would tell you to think about though is consider the conditions that each one of these wants when you're planting something like a mixed planting. I think we kind of think like herbs are all herbs. They can grow together. But actually a lot of the ones down here on this spectrum grow in kind of Mediterranean climates, right? Where they have long dry periods, they like good drainage. That's really what they want. Whereas like basil just wants to be happy all the time. Like basil doesn't want a dry period, right? Basil's not trying to do that. So just think about this in your mixed plantings. Like I actually think this is a little bit problematic, that basil right there. But that you really do want to read the tags or the instructions for each one and figure out kind of what they want before you just plop them all together and you'll have better success.
How do you classify arugula? I planted some last year and it's still, it's still growing beautifully and strong.
Yeah, and that's the other thing too, is we've had such a mild winter here this year especially that we've had a lot of things that normally would have gotten knocked out by frost or at least knocked back that have gone for a while. So I would think to plant it each year, but yeah, there are things here that will go forever, right?
Yeah.
Until you kill them. Contain your mints. Okay? This is important. If you're gonna plant mints, put them in a pot. They get out of hand, they go everywhere, they're really fun. Just contain them. My one exception is mints that you've planted specifically for pollinators, and they are the native mints. And that's because, like, whatever, there are worse things that could escape. And specifically, I wanted to give basil a shout out as really a gold star herb. If you leave from this and you're like, that all sounds really fun, but oh God, I'm going to kill everything. Get yourself a basil plant, right? Put it in a nice sized pot, see how it does on your patio. Maybe get yourself a cherry tomato, right? Of all the tomatoes you can start with, try a cherry tomato. Of all the everything else you can start with, try a basil plant. They're going to be delicious together. They're relatively easy. And basil is another one that I think is really, really nice because when you forget about it and it starts flowering, the flowers are pretty, right? They ultimately mean the basil doesn't taste that good anymore, but they're pretty. And so the one thing I'll say is that when you harvest basil, you actually want to do something that feels a little bit drastic, but the plant will thank you. Don't take individual leaves, because otherwise you'll just end up with a plant with long stalks and no leaves. Actually, like, pinch back. Like, I would pinch back that whole top, right? 6-8 leaves down. Because it'll just start sending up shot sides, right? And it'll get nice and bushy and stay vigorous. And anytime I see flowers coming, even before that, I pinch those off, right? I'm always removing the flowers, because the moment it really flowers, it starts taking nutrients from its leaves and it doesn't taste as good. But when you totally forget, that's pretty, right? So kind of my last note to you is that a lot of the second half of this talk was actually taken from this publication from the University of Georgia. It is a really, really great, really useful publication, and I made it kind of a short link to it for people. If you forget all of this, the vast majority of it is in that publication in greater detail even, and so I would say check that out. So with that, I'm going to wrap up, but I am going to ask that you actually fill out the evaluation. It's two-sided, I'm sorry. And I'll be here to take questions, or if anyone has a burning question, they can shout it out. Yeah. Yeah. So something of interest, if you guys are so inclined, is that Duke Gardens does a plant sale every year. It's at the end of March, and the Master Gardeners will be selling plants at the plant sale. They'll have all sorts of veggies, but they'll also have an amazing selection of ornamentals, annuals, perennials, kind of everything that you might want for your yard, and the prices are great. Like, I think some of the other vendors hate us.
We don't have dates on that.
March 27th and the March 28th, it's open to the general public. It's at Duke Gardens. It's in the morning.
March
What's
26th
the
is
best
for
way to test pH, would you say? Like, can you
Soil
give us
test,
a soil test? Okay.
unfortunately. They'll sell it. They'll give you, like, Lowe's will sell you another kit.
Right. Are those
A pH
accurate?
probe I wouldn't use.
Yeah.
I don't think they're accurate. Like a general pH test kit should work, but to my mind, it's like the other version is free and gives me way more information. So like,
Okay, thanks.
So if you are going to do a raised bed, then you don't necessarily need to do a